Alright, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about how to do a toned paper drawing or a toned drawing, okay? Now, this is something that when I draw traditionally, I have a toned paper sketchbook, which means instead of having white pages, the pages are either a mid-tone gray or a mid-tone brown or tan. You can use both dark and light colored pencils or whatever you want to use to be able to paint different tones on it. That's another reason why I like to start with the mid-tone in case I want to do something like this. So having a mid-tone means that when you're drawing and you're shading, usually when you're drawing on white, anything that is less or darker than the color white, you're going to have to color in. But when you're doing a mid-tone drawing, instead, all of your mid-tones are already there. You're starting with a mid-tone instead of starting with a white, right? So instead of when you're drawing on white paper, you just leave out the spots where you want there to be highlights. On mid-tone paper, you actually have to draw in the highlights, and you leave out the spots that are going to be mid-tone, and then you add in the spots that are going to be darker. All you use is a black brush and a white brush to do both of these, okay? Now, to get this set up, I have my layer opacity turned a little bit down. I had it on full, but I lowered it just a little bit so that it wasn't quite. I have my layer opacity brought down just a little bit so it wasn't quite so in your face. And then I also have my other layers on. I did go ahead and refine this sketch from the last time we saw it because I wanted to, you want your sketch to be pretty much at the point you're ready for it to be finished at when you do this. So I do have it pretty much finished up right now. I am going to lower the layer opacity of some of the ones underneath. I do like seeing some of that line come through, but not a ton. I just barely want it to be visible. We have that, and then I have my mid-tone here that's on its own layer. Okay? So on a new layer on top of everything else is where I'm going to do I'm going to have two layers. One will be the highlights and one will be the shadows. I'm going to start actually with the highlights, and we're going to go pure white for this. I have my brush selected, and I'm going to imagine that the light source is coming from up above, directly up above, and you do want to think about that when you start. You're basically going to be sketching in the light, right? You're going to be drawing in where the light is coming from. So since it's coming from above, it's going to be hitting the top of this. And since we are on a new layer on top of everything else, I can slightly be able to draw over the lines a little bit, so you want to be careful there. But you do want that available because then you can control the thickness of certain lines and stuff like that. Okay, so doing that, you also can use this to imply a lot of really neat texture. Okay, let's do move on to like his nose area here, and we're getting the top of his head. So once again, I'm thinking about the light source and where this is going to start to fade off at. Okay, because it's not going to go on forever. Okay, catching a little bit of light on the edge of his nose there. Excellent. Then we'll get the edge of this here. It's also going to be catching the light. Perfect. You can already see it starting to kind of break out that form. Okay. Then we will get the top of his head. Okay, and then also this shape right here. These guys are actually going to be mostly white because I want them to be filled in. Want them to be lighter than everything else. So we add that in there. You'll notice that it's not like in the 3 steady value that we did. It's similar to that where you had to take your image and break it apart into 3 values. Oh, sorry, that was for if you've taken the I apologize. If you've taken the light and color course, one of the assignments is to take an image and break it into 3 values. Now, this is similar to that, except for that there can still be variations between white, black, and gray. So if you push softly, then you can get a little bit softer of an effect, so you don't have to go straight all the way to white or straight all the way to black. You can keep it kind of like a in-between tone and reserve those whites for really just the brightest of spots. So I'm going to bring my brush up pretty large here so that I can get a little bit bigger areas all at once. A little bit too sloppy there. Fix that. I'm sticking with the pencil brush, even though it would be easier to use a different brush, like say a paintbrush type brush, because I want this to still feel like a sketch. And so I'm just going to take my time to use my pencil to bust out this value here instead of just going and using like a brush, because that would be easier, but then we would miss kind of the effect that we're going for, which is to make it look like a sketch. So, and then I'm just going to highlight these ridges here that you can kind of see showing through. Okay, So we have that. We got the nose area for the most part. We have, we're going to be catching some light on the top of the jaw here on that side. And we can draw some of those lines, those edges being caught by the light. We could catch this side over here. That will be catching the light, as well as this. And we'll fill this in. So we fill that in with light, and then we'll be getting just a couple of these areas, like on his lip will be slightly lit up. His teeth, we'll get parts of his tongue. So for the teeth, even though we know the teeth are white, we want to think about this in terms of value. So we're not just drawing them completely white, right? Because we know that there is a shadow that's going to be cast from his lip. And so I'm not drawing it all the way up to his lip, because I want the shadow to show that it's casting. And we'll just leave that part, the mid-tone value, to help get that idea across, okay? Same with these teeth that we're going to be doing down on his jaw. It will just be a little edge of light that's showing, and then the rest of it is mostly just going to be in shadow. We have that. Let's do a little bit more up here on his jaw, some more areas that are going to be catching the light. Maybe not that much. In fact, I think the way that this is going to work out, I think it would look better if we have the light look like it's coming from more of this angle. So what I'm going to do then is erase all of this. This is all going to be mostly in shadow, as well as this, because of the fin on his head. And so the light will kind of end about right there. Even actually further back. We won't even be reaching that. Okay, which means we can do a little bit more of a rim light along the edge of all of this. We'll light up this edge of the mouth here, and all these teeth, and then the tongue as well. Then we have the side of his face we can light up a little bit more. And then let's get these teeth. And then this tooth up here will probably not quite be as bright. We'll just have a little section that's being really well lit. Go ahead and erase that arrow mark we made. Alright, and then also that's going to leave for us, we'll have little light edges along the top of these spines here. Lower my brush size a little bit more. And then once we finish this part, we will go into our shadow layer. Now, I like to go back and forth a lot between my shadow and my light instead of just going all the way with all of the light. So we did go pretty far with the light, but I'll probably end up coming back to kind of end up touching some things up, just in order to make sure that things are staying right and looking somewhat consistent. Okay. Also, I'm going to lower the opacity on my brush, and oops, way more than that. Might have to come back with a different brush to do this, but I do want it to look like those fins are glowing because the light's coming through, but we might have to come back and do that, which is totally fine. Okay, so we have our lights, and that looks about good, I think, for where we want our lights to be, our highlights and everything. I'm going to add just a little bit more to the inside of his mouth in some areas to help make it look a little glossier. Just doing some last minute touches. Okay, let's take a break from this and add, one more thing. I want to make sure I get this right. This edge I think needs to be a little bit softer and pulled back. There we go. That looks better. Let's throw our shadow layer on there now. And so we're going to go all the way black this time. And we're going to make a new layer. Oh, we already have that layer made. We're just going to select it. And this will be our shadow layer. And this is a layer where we're going to start finding the, let's make sure it's on, finding the darkest parts first and bringing those all the way back to where they need to be value-wise. So for example, under his tongue, I'm mostly going to be using hatching to do this part, cross-hatching different variations to get things where they need to be value-wise. Fill in this area here. His mouth is going to be pretty dark compared to everywhere else because there's not a lot of light that's reaching all the way inside of there and a lot of these cracks and crevices and stuff. Fill this in. Make sure we catch any sort of like ledges or things like that that are going to be casting shadows or have edges to them. Okay. We can add some little value and texture to his tongue. Okay. There's going to be a point where his tongue kind of falls in the shadow, and that's sort of where we want to shade everything so that it looks like it's inside of his mouth in the dark, and same with everything else that's going to be past that point. Alright, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing over here to really make sure we get any of those spots that are going to be all the way black. Underneath, I'm moving up here to his jaw now, and I'm thinking about where these cast shadows are going to be and filling those in, as well as we can start working on his face a little bit. I'm just rounding off these forms to try and get them to feel a little bit more real, putting a little bit of a shadow edge on the bottom there, okay? Inside of his eyes where it's going to start to really kind of get dark because it's in that deep crevice. We'll leave a little area on his eye for kind of like a highlight, so it's not all the way dark in there. And then underneath his eye, or underneath this horn, this ridge on his head, it's really going to get pretty deep in shadow inside of there. So we add that value, and we're going to make sure that we try and keep this consistent all the way through this side of his face where it's not getting hit by the light, which means this down here, his piece of bone with all the teeth sticking out of it, we're going to darken that up a little bit. We'll leave the teeth the way they are because they're kind of like that mid-tone is white as if it were in the shadow. Excellent. Let's put this in here pretty dark. It's on the inside of the mouth. It's really not going to be getting hardly any light in there. Then we can add some of these shadows and features that kind of help define these forms. Really starting to get dark in some areas so we can really define stuff. Let's get over here on this side. It's a little bit too dark. So down under here will be in shadow of this fin that's not facing the light. And then under his chin, working on his jaw, and then this part of his head as well. Going to bring my brush size up, and add a little bit of darkness around the edges of this because that will help it make it look transparent when we get to that part. Because the flesh where it connects to those tines gets a little bit darker, which means less light is going to be showing through, which will help kind of give it that effect. Also, let's darken up this. It's working so far. Edges of his jaw. Okay, under here, underneath his neck, it's really going to get dark in some areas. So I'm really going to push that in here. Rework that a little bit too sloppy there. Excellent. Really want to get this edge here a little bit darker. I'll push the blacks a little bit in some areas. What I might end up doing is going back and lowering the opacity on the white layer, and then adding a new layer so that I can go even brighter. And add in some highlights since we went pretty bright on that first pass. Might even do the same thing with the shadows as well. That's one of the benefits of working digitally, is being able to manipulate those layers. It's kind of it drives me crazy how so many people think that it's kind of like cheating, or I don't know. They have like this weird stigma, and it's ridiculous. Because if you can't draw, then having a tablet's not suddenly going to make you be able to draw. You have to know how to draw first, you know. I'm going to say that for now that's about good. Let's go ahead and do what I said we're going to do. We're going to lower the opacity on the whites just a tad, lower the opacity on our shadows as well a little bit. Then I'm going to make a new layer on top that's going to be my new white layer, and we're going to add our brightest whites. And then the white on top of this part of his horn. Okay, we can get the white on this edge as well as down here. Catch a few brighter highlights on the tongue. Let's keep them right about here. I'm going to go back to the other layer since we have the opacity lowered now, and I can add in a few other spots where I want there to be light, but I don't want it to be super bright and in your face. So some of these areas on his face here, and then as well as down here, we can add a little more. And then same up here, there's going to be, even though this isn't in our direct sunlight, which is why we're not going to have it as bright, there is ambient light that will be lighting up some of these forms. So that's what we're adding in over here, and then you can use that to light some of these sort of spiky things he's got on him. Okay. That's looking pretty fantastic. We're going to do a little bit of white up here. So we'll go back to our new layer, our bright whites layer that we have reserved for the sort of like the brightest, and I'm going to retouch up the tips of all of these tines because I want those to really get bright. And then I can also get some of these spikes on his back. Go back to this layer underneath. Like I said, I'm going back and forth quite a bit, working the whole image. Using the light color to highlight some of these scales will help them feel like they're a little more prominent. Let's do just a little bit of light on the edge of this part of his mouth. And then a little bit on the top of his tongue in there. We can lighten up the teeth just a little bit since we're using not as bright of a white. Let's do, oh, you know what, while we're here, let's try seeing if we can, with this sort of toned down white, let's see if we can get that glowy effect we were looking for, where it feels like the light is kind of shining through. And I think we're going to need to get closer to the edges here to make this happen and have it look right. And it does start to kind of give it that effect. So let's finish up all of these fins and then erase out. There's some areas where there's like supposed to be rips and kind of like holes in the skin.